Shabbat Shalom, welcome. Today we start a new book in the Torah called the Book of Exodus or the Book of Shemot. And Shemot in Hebrew means names, names. So we're starting a new book today. And before we start, I'm going to say the blessing. And it says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with your commandments and commanded us to engage ourselves in the words of the Torah. Amen, amen, amen. So today's Torah portion is named Shemot, which means names. It's found in the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 1. So recalling that last time we had that Jacob died and now Joseph is with his brothers in Egypt. And so they are living in Egypt. And at this time we find ourselves in a new situation with the people of Israel. So in chapter 1, verse 1, it says, now these are the names, Shemot, of the children of Israel who came into Egypt with Jacob, each man with his family. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The souls that came out of the line of Jacob numbered 70 in all, while Joseph was already in Egypt. Remember that we had talked about that the number 70 is mostly a symbolic number because we know there were more than 70 people. This number has to do with completion. This number has to do with holiness. This number has to do with the temple. So basically it's talking about a generation that is blessed that went down to Egypt. Another thing we also have to recall is to try to understand, I said it last time, the culture of Egypt, because if we understand the background of the culture of Egypt, it's going to help us understand many things that happen. They're going to happen in Egypt with the people of Israel. Verse 6, then Joseph died, as did all his brothers and all that generation. In other words, the original leaders, the original children of the tribes of Israel. All those now have passed away along with their children, grandchildren. So we have newer generations that have been living in Egypt. If you recall, when God spoke to Abraham, he told Abraham that his descendants would be in Egypt for 400 years. He said they'll be in slavery for 400 years. Now we know that really the time that the children were in Egypt, they were slaves for only 210 years. Okay, so now we have a whole bunch of generations that have passed by since Jacob went to Egypt. Verse 7. Yet the children of Israel were fruitful, increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew extremely numerous, so the land was filled with them. So again, according to the promise that God gave Abraham, they were fructifying, they were multiplying, they were growing in numbers. Because we have to understand that this book of Exodus is a continuation of the book of Genesis. In Genesis, we find the promises that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in Exodus, we're going to see fulfilling of many of those promises. Verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So you have to understand that from the time that Joseph lived till he passed away, many pharaohs have been king in Egypt. So as many years have passed by, and so here comes one that says did not know Joseph. Now we have to understand that Egypt was very meticulous in keeping records. So we know there were records of Joseph, of what had happened, of all the things that Joseph did, because Joseph was the second in command after Pharaoh. So in that sense, there's no excuse for this Pharaoh not to know Joseph. But then again, we have to understand that really what they're trying to say is that this king did not recognize all the righteousness and justice that Joseph had performed during his time as the second in command in Egypt. So in other words, he's ignoring all the righteousness that Joseph and his family had done while they lived in the land of Egypt. he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are too numerous and too powerful for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or else they will grow even more numerous, so that if war breaks out, they may join our enemies, fight against us, and then escape from the land. So what this new king is fearing is that these people, if they were to unite with the enemies of Egypt, being so numerous, they would overcome Egypt. So in that sense, this Pharaoh is afraid of the children of Israel. So now he's trying to come up with a way, a means, how to make sure they stop multiplying, they stop growing, because they are a menace to him. Verse 11, so they set slave masters over them to afflict them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as storage cities for Pharaoh. Now these slave masters turned out to be people from within them, Hebrew men that they chose to be the slave masters of the Hebrews. Why? Because of more familiarity, their closeness, so they chose people that they would know. Another thing is, it's talking about slaves. You have to remember that initially, when Joseph is ruling and reigning in Egypt, there really did not exist slavery. They had servants, they had bond servants, or they had servants that worked the land, and they were paid by the harvest or by food. But they were really not slaves. They were not mistreated. They were treated well. But now, things have changed after all these years. You have to understand that Egypt goes through a number of dynasties. And this dynasty that is here has no appreciation for the Hebrew people, for the children of Israel. They see them as a threat. And so now slavery comes into play. So now instead of just being servants, they have become true slaves. So they set slave masters over them to afflict them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as storage cities for Pharaoh. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and the more they spread. So the Egyptians dreaded the presence of the children of Israel. They worked them harshly and made their lives bitter with hard labor, with mortar and brick, doing all sorts of work in the fields. In all their labors, they worked them with cruelty. So what's going on is not just that they're slaves, they're being mistreated. There's oppression, there's cruelty, there's injustice. Because we have to understand, in the ancient Near East, every time a king comes into to start ruling, every time there was a new king that came to the throne, one of the things that the people used as a measurement to know if this king was good or was bad was that this king would do acts of righteousness. And some of the things they would do once they came to be enthroned, for example, they would cancel debts, they would free prisoners, they would give land back to the people, they would proclaim liberty and justice for everybody. But this guy is doing none of these things. So right from the get-go, we see that this Pharaoh is an unrighteous, unjust ruler. And he's taken it against the people of Israel. Verse 15, moreover, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. One of them was named Shifra and the other Pua, and said, when you help the Hebrew women during childbirth, look at the sex. If it is a son, then kill him. But if it's a daughter, she may live. So now Pharaoh secretly is telling the midwives, when they go to help the Hebrew women give labor, to kill if it's a boy. Why? Because if these boys grow up, become men, they're going to be a threat to Pharaoh. So this is done secretly because he's speaking to the midwives. And not only that, they always had midwives that came in pairs. Why? Because during this time, you have to understand that labor was not like going to a hospital and having all these facilities. They usually had their children at home, and they had this special, what they would call a birth stool, where the woman would kind of crouch over the footstool. And so then one of the midwives would hold them while the other one would help bring the baby out. And so it says that if it's a son, to kill him. But if it's a daughter, to let her live. Yet the midwives feared God, so they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? Let the boys live. The midwives told Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are like animals and give birth before the midwife comes to them. In other words, they were so strong that they were able to have their babies without the help of a midwife. Verse 20, so God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied, growing very numerous. Because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. In other words, God honored what they did because they saved the children instead of killing them, like Pharaoh had decreed. So they feared more God than they did Pharaoh. And you have to remember that in the Egyptian culture, Pharaoh was seen as a god. But Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, now it has gone from being secretly trying to kill the babies to now a public decree. But Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, you are to cast every son that is born into the river. What river? The river Nile. But let every daughter live. Now, one thing that we have to also understand about the culture is what they call trial by waters. Trial by waters. And that meant that when someone was being judged for something that they did that was illegal or came against, for example, the rulership, they would take that individual, tie their hands and their feet, and throw them into the river Nile. Why? Because before them, the river Nile was a god, and the waters represented the underworld. So if this individual was guilty of whatever he or she was accused, they would throw them into the water, and if that person survived the waters. Now you have to remember that the Nile is full of crocodiles, hippopotamus, and if you're chained up, probably they even put rocks in their feet or something, and you go down, you're going to drown. So the thing was, if the person survived, that meant that that person was innocent. But if the person died, that meant that that person was guilty. So try to imagine these newborn babies. They're thrown into the river full of crocodiles, and they're going to sink. They probably don't swim, can't swim, and they're not going to make it. So they understood that if the children didn't make it, that they were against Pharaoh. Okay, so this is what's called a trial by waters. And so they did this with all the boys, and they threw them into the water. It's also ironic because all these children were killed in the Nile, and we know later on as we read that Pharaoh in the waters also is judged, and he's drowned in the waters when they're crossing the Red Sea. Chapter 2. Now a man from the house of Levi took as his wife a daughter of Levi. So we have a Levitical family. The woman conceived and gave birth to a son. Now when she saw that he was delightful, she hid him for 3 months. Now the word here that's translated as delightful, some translations say that the baby was beautiful. In the Hebrews, the word tov, T-O-V, and that word means that the baby is complete, that there's nothing missing, that the baby has all the potential to fulfill the purpose, the role that God had implanted in the baby. The purpose, the role, and the function that was implanted in the baby. So that's why he's called Tov. But she hid him for 3 months. Again, remember that numbers in the Bible most of the time are symbolic. They mean something, and we have to understand their meaning according to the Bible and the temple. The number 3 here means redemption, resurrection, restoration, new life. So through this child is telling us that at 3 months in this child, we could see the future of redemption, of restoration, of new life. Verse 3. But when she could no longer hide him, excuse me, she took a basket of papyrus reeds, coated it with tar and pitch, put the child inside, and laid it in the reeds by the bank of the Nile.